in the grand tapestry of the Tudor court. Anne Boleyn is often painted in extremes, the martyr or the schemer, the victim or the adulteress. But history is rarely that simple. While Anne's story is etched in blood and controversy, her sister Mary remains a figure of quiet mystery, often cast merely as her sister's shadow. To truly understand them, we must look past the labels and see two women navigating a world where their only currency was their beauty and their family's ambition. This isn't just a story of a king's obsession. It's a story of two sisters who were both trapped and empowered by the same system. Anne and Mary were likely born around 1500, with their childhoods shaped by the halls of Hever Castle in Kent. Their father, Thomas Boleyn, was a careerist and a diplomat, and their mother, Elizabeth Howard, hailed from one of England's most formidable families. Together, they ensured their daughters received an education far beyond the standard for noble women of the time, a preparation not just for marriage, but for the complex power games of the court. Around 1513, the sisters' paths diverged. Anne was sent to the prestigious court of Margaret of Austria, a sophisticated school for young noblewomen, where she learned the art of poise, music, and the nuances of European power. While Anne was being refined in the Habsburg Netherlands, Mary remained in England. History often suggests Mary was the more domestic of the two, perhaps less prepared for the brutal intrigues of court life than her younger, more precocious sister. It would be easy to imagine resentment between them. But the records suggest a more complex relationship, neither overtly hostile nor deeply affectionate. In 1514, they reunited to travel to France as part of the entourage for Princess Mary Tudor's marriage to King Louis XII. When the king died shortly after, Mary returned to England, while Anne remained in France for several more years. This time apart was pivotal. Anne observed how women could exert influence in a refined, intellectual environment, while Mary returned to the immediate, physical presence of the English court. B. 1519. Mary had become a lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, placing her directly in the line of sight of Henry VIII. It was during this time that Mary became the king's mistress. In modern eyes, this is often seen as a scandal, but in the 16th century, it was a position of precarious importance. Mary was constantly present, but remained on the periphery of true power. She felt the insecurity of the system. Closeness to the king offered no permanent protection. When Anne finally returned to England in 1522, the contrast was immediate. Anne brought with her a French elegance and a confident demeanor that was scarce at the Tudor court. She stood out not just for her looks, but for her intellectual acuity. While the exact end of Mary's affair with Henry is unknown, by 1526, the king's focus had shifted entirely. He began to court Anne with gifts and passionate letters. But Anne had watched Mary's experience. She knew that being a mistress meant being disposable, and she chose a different, Phariskia path. To understand Henry's obsession with Anne, we must understand his desperation for a son. After 20 years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon, only one child, Mary Tudor, had survived. For Henry, this wasn't just a personal disappointment, it was a dynastic crisis. He began to interpret his lack of a male heir as divine punishment, believing his marriage to his brother's widow was a sin in the eyes of God. Henry sought an annulment from Rome, but the Pope was paralyzed by the political influence of Catherine's nephew, the powerful Charles V. For years, the king was caught between his desire for Anne and his duty to the state. Anne, meanwhile, remained at a distance, refusing to become a mistress and instead holding out for the crown. This wasn't necessarily cold calculation. It was a woman seeking the only form of security that existed in her world, the status of a legitimate wife and queen. By 1531, the stalemate reached a breaking point. Henry banished Catherine from court, a move that shocked the nation but cleared the way for the Boleyns. In January 1533, Henry and Anne married in secret. The haste was driven by a single, hopeful fact: Anne was pregnant. For Henry, this was the moment of vindication. He had broken with the Roman Catholic Church and declared himself the head of the Church of England, all to secure the future of his house through the son he believed Anne would bear. The Boleyn family reached the pinnacle of influence. In June 1533, a heavily pregnant Anne was crowned Queen of England in a ceremony of unprecedented magnificence. For 4 days, London was a stage for her triumph, filled with festivals, processions, and banquets. At that moment, Anne must have felt she had achieved the impossible. But even at the height of her power, she was vulnerable. The people still loved Catherine, and the weight of Henry's expectations for a son was a burden that grew heavier with every passing day. In September 1620, Anne gave birth to a healthy, strong child, but it was a girl, Elizabeth. The disappointment was a turning point. Henry's gaze, once filled with obsession, began to cool. Anne found herself in an impossible position. She was no longer the desired woman, but a queen who had failed her primary duty in the eyes of the king. She became outspoken and contradictory, refusing to tolerate Henry's wandering eye, which only fueled the tension in their marriage. It was during this fragile period that Mary reappeared at court as a lady-in-waiting to her sister. But Mary was carrying a secret that would lead to her own downfall within the family. She had married William Stafford, a man of no title or fortune, out of genuine love and without the king's or her family's permission. For the Boleyns, who were fighting for their survival at the top of the social ladder, this was an unforgivable scandal. Anne's reaction to Mary's secret marriage was harsh and immediate. Mary was pregnant and married to a commoner, a move that threatened the carefully curated dignity of the Boleyn name. Anne banished her sister from court, leaving her without support or protection. The two sisters, who had shared the halls of heaven and the courts of France, would never see each other again. Mary turned to Thomas Cromwell, the man orchestrating the king's affairs, begging for mercy and help, but her pleas were ignored. In many ways, Mary's banishment was her salvation. While she was cast out into a life of relative poverty and obscurity, she was also removed from the lethal circle that was closing in on her sister. As Anne struggled to maintain her grip on a husband whose patience was exhausted, Mary was building a life based on her own choices, far from the king's dangerous whims. By 1536, Anne's time had run out. She had failed to bear a son, and Henry had already turned his focus to Jane Seymour, a woman who represented the quiet submissiveness he now craved. Cromwell, sensing the shift, orchestrated a brutal end to the marriage. Anne was accused of high treason and adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George, on May 2 at Etienne Aubay Saint-Gelais. Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The trials that followed were a formality. The verdict was decided before she even entered the room. On May 19, just 3 years after her magnificent coronation, Anne was executed by a French swordsman, a final mercy from the king. She was buried in the Tower Chapel, an unmarked grave for a woman who had once been the centre of the world. Days later, Henry married Jane Seymour, finally moving on to the next chapter of his desperate search for an heir. While Anne's branch of the family tree ended in tragedy, Mary's continued in secret. After the deaths of her sister and brother, and the eventual death of her father, Mary inherited the Boleyn estate. She lived out her days far from the court, away from the judgment of a public that had never loved her sister. Mary died on July 19, Etienne Aubay, her life a testament to the fact that survival is often found in the shadows. But the Boleyn influence did not die with Anne. Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, would eventually become one of England's greatest monarchs, rehabilitating her mother's memory through her own success. And Mary's descendants would quietly marry into the highest levels of the English aristocracy for generations. Ultimately, it was Mary's bloodline that returned the Boleyn legacy to the throne, centuries later, through the lineage of the modern royal family. In the end, Anne and Mary Boleyn were two women who faced the same impossible choices. Anne reached for the stars and was consumed by the fire, while Mary chose the ground and found peace. One became a legend of tragedy, the other became a legend of survival. Their lives remind us that behind the grand scandals and the political upheaval of the Tudor era, there were real human beings, sisters, who loved, struggled, and did whatever they could to navigate a world that was never designed for them to win. Their story is a reminder that power is a fleeting gift, but the choices we make for ourselves, for love or for peace, are what truly endure.